For your ears only for the week of January 27th, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Catherine Herzog.
We must make the hard choices to reduce the cost of health care and the size of our deficit. But we reject the belief that America must choose between caring for the generation that built this country and investing in the generation that will build its future. We must be a source of hope to the poor, the sick, the marginalized, the victims of prejudice, not out of mere charity, but because peace in our time requires the constant advance of those principles that our common creed describes: tolerance and opportunity, human dignity, and justice.
The Gettysburg Address was an attempt at healing the nation's wounds at the end of the Civil War. Obama's speech yesterday was a left-wing declaration of war.
With stirring phrases and predictable reference to Martin Luther King on his Memorial Day in frosty Washington, Barack Obama last week stressed traditional values and progressive goals in his second inaugural address. And it drove conservatives like Brent Bozell of the Media Research Center to equally predictable partisan hyperbole.
If it was a declaration of war, however, congressional Republicans were quick to raise a white flag, at least temporarily. They agreed to raise the controversial debt ceiling and defer the battle over budget and deficit cutting for another 3 months. There was considerable rhetorical pushback on the renewed Democratic fight against gun violence, but a major demonstration for it in Washington at the weekend underscored more widespread popular involvement in the debate than ever before. To talk about the inauguration, Obama's rebooted agenda, Republican counter-strategy, and related issues, we're joined again by TV commentator Eleanor Clift, also a contributor at NewsweekDailyBeast.com. Welcome back to the program.
Glad to be with you.
First, the GOP debt ceiling retreat. You say that may generate primary challenges from even more conservative Republicans that Democrats think will help them in next year's midterm elections. Can you explain that?
Well, 199 Republicans supported it, and so they okayed an extension of the debt ceiling, but they didn't get any spending cuts in return. And so those 199 Republicans, undoubtedly all, or if not certainly most, campaigned on no new revenue and cutting spending. And so they're going to have to go back to their districts. And so it opens the door for a challenge from the right. And Democrats feel that the more the Republican Party gets pushed to the right in primaries, that they have a better shot in the general election.
Will the Republicans really have more leverage in March when the continuing resolution for government operations must be renewed and mandatory spending cuts are supposed to kick in? Or will they face even greater danger of looking heedless to the nation's current needs?
Well, that's the politics as it's going to play out. They really had no leverage here in this initial round of the debt ceiling fight. The president refused to engage, and all the polls showed that the congressional approval is like a third of what the president is. So they really had no high ground on which to fight. I think the coming deadlines, at least the White House intends to engage, and so there'll be some jockeying. They're in a somewhat better position. But the president so far has been pretty skillful using the political capital that he won with re-election.
The House debt ceiling bill still required Democratic support, as earlier on the fiscal cliff vote. Is that a new pattern for progress, Democrats joining less conservative Republicans?
Well, it violates the Speaker's rule, Speaker Boehner's rule, that he didn't want to bring anything to the floor that couldn't pass with a majority that was made up of the majority. But he couldn't get the votes in either the fiscal cliff fight late last year, or I guess it was January 1 or 2, and he couldn't get that majority for this extension of the debt ceiling. And so it puts Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader, in a much stronger position. The assumption was that she'd be on the sidelines, but they need Democratic votes to pass anything in the House. And if John Boehner calculates that the Republican Party and the Republican brand will lose more if everything dies in the House, then yes, this could be the model for future legislation on other contentious issues.
What's the likely outcome you see on gun safety? A renewed ban on military-style weapons, only on high-capacity magazines, just more background checks, mental health screening and treatment?
Well, I agree with Senator Feinstein, who said this week that it's an uphill fight, and she can't predict how it's going to come out. Right now, the NRA seems committed to hold all its members, and half the politicians in the Congress have A ratings from the NRA, and the NRA really does not want that assault weapons ban to go through. If they could get the ban on the large-size magazines, that would be a significant improvement. And if they could get a universal background check. People who follow the issue of gun violence say that the universal background check would actually have more impact on the lethality of guns than a ban on assault weapons. So I think it's interesting because the Congress will not shift its positions unless they really feel pressure from their constituents.
What chance do you give to Republican schemes for changing the way the popular vote in some states is translated in the Electoral College? Theoretically, it would have made Mitt Romney president, even with Obama's 3% lead at the polls.
I would like to say it's preposterous, but I think they present the argument and they make it sound like it's fairer than what we currently have, because every congressional district would have its voice heard. But the practicality of it, of course, would be to have people packed into urban districts who tend to vote Democratic have their votes count somewhat less than rural districts, which have fewer people and tend to be more Republican. It's gerrymandering on steroids, if you will. And some Republicans have really backed away from it. Initial foray in Virginia, I mean, they see how controversial it is. But the Republicans who are meeting at their retreat have basically endorsed this idea. So I expect we'll see more of it, especially in states where Republicans control the legislature.
Speaking of steroids, some think that Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid needs some. How do you explain his agreeing to very watered-down reform of the filibuster rule, despite earlier promises to really rein it in so more legislation and appointments can get through?
Yeah, the Democratic leader, Harry Reid, is really a creature of the Senate, and I think he cares more about the rituals and the institutions of the Senate than he does about any particular president's agenda. And it's a very clubby place, and this was worked out between the two leaders, Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. It only nibbles around the edges of the dysfunctionality of the body. And so, yes, I think people who thought that real reform might happen are very disappointed. But if you take a generous view towards what Reid did, really nothing can happen in the Senate unless there is some collegiality between the two bodies, between the two parties, because every senator is a king, and they can really gum up the works. And so I think he thinks if he had gone further with this, he would have lost what little goodwill exists in the Senate, and that it might have been more destructive in the end. I think that's debatable, but I suspect that's his calculus.
TV commentator Eleanor Clift is also a contributor at NewsweekDailyBeast.com.
Quote from the news, "So, a female turret gunner is protecting a division commander. I realized something had changed and it was time to do something about it." That was General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, on the experience in Baghdad that led him to recommend an end to the ban on women in combat roles. But Dempsey also said it would take some time to get it right and develop uniform physical requirements for both sexes.
Next, a Republican strategist on rebooting the GOP. For your ears only.